Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming on this election day. I hope you've all voted, and if you haven't, go vote after. My name is Linda Levy, and I'm director of the JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of two public lectures that are sponsored by the JDC Archives this year in the context of our Fred and Ellen Lewis JDC Archives Fellowship Program. We're delighted with the response, and I want to tell you first a little bit about the JDC Archives. We house the records of the Joint since its founding in 1914, over 102 years ago, and it's one of the most important repositories of modern Jewish history, given the depth and the breadth of JDC's work in so many countries over these last 102 years. Visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique holdings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, family researchers, curators of museum exhibits, filmmakers, and others. I invite you to visit our wonderful website at archives.jdc.org and to see the online exhibits, peruse our photo collection, check out our names index, and research in our online text collections. We have put online significant amounts of our text collections, over 2.5 million pages. I'd like to recognize and thank the Center for Jewish History for co-sponsoring this program today, and I'd like to call on Chris Bartel to offer greetings from the center.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Chris Barthel. I'm Director of Academic Programs here at the Center for Jewish History. And many of you may already know the Center for our many public programs on Jewish history and culture, and is home to the 5 partner organizations here: American Jewish Historical Society, American Sephardi Federation, Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And the collections that the partners have here in this building document more than 500 years of Jewish history, and they together comprise the largest archive of the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. And of course, as is the case with the JDC Archives, these collections are an indispensable resource for scholars, journalists, genealogists, and other researchers who are investigating Jewish history, including those who are supported by the Center's fellowship program. And it is with particular pleasure that we host a talk today by Professor Glenn Dynner, who is the Center's NEH Senior Scholar in the 2013-2014 academic year. And we've had the opportunity to hear from Glenn about his research at the Center, particularly in the collections of YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. And I'm sure his work in the JDC Archives that he'll present today will be every bit as enlightening. So thank you very much for coming, and please consider taking a calendar of our public programs that is outside in the Great Hall after the program, and you can see what we have available for the rest of 2016. And if you're further interested in programs, please feel free to speak with me, and I can make sure that you're on our email list to see that you receive those notifications. And I would invite Linda Levy back up to the podium. Thank you.
I'd like to first tell you a little bit about this fellowship and about Ellen Lewis. Ellen Lewis was a longtime JDC employee who, as a German Jewish refugee, was helped by JDC in Shanghai. She began working for JDC in Shanghai, and after arrival in New York, continued to work for JDC for many years. She left a very significant bequest to JDC and earmarked a portion of it for the JDC Archives. In tribute to Ellen Lewis, the JDC Archives initiated this fellowship in 2012 to enable scholars engaged in graduate-level, postdoctoral, or independent research to conduct research in the JDC Archives. We felt that this was a fitting tribute to Ellen Lewis. Our speaker today, Professor Glenn Dynner, is one of 2 fellows who have been awarded this fellowship this year. He will be addressing us today on the topic, The Fountain of Judaism, JDC Aid to Traditionalist Jews in Interwar and Nazi-Occupied Poland. Our format is that Professor Dynner will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and this will be followed by about 15 minutes of time for questions, and we'll entertain questions then. Our speaker, Glenn Dynner, is Professor of Religion at Sarah Lawrence College. His scholarship centers on East European Jewry with a focus on the social history of Hasidism and the Haskalah. His scholarly interests also include Polish-Jewish relations, Jewish economic history, and popular religion. Professor Dynner is the author of the highly acclaimed book, Men of Silk, The Hasidic Conquest of Polish-Jewish Society, which won the Koret Publication Award and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. His most recent book is a groundbreaking study titled Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor, and Life in the Kingdom of Poland. Professor Dynner has also edited several books, including a volume of Polin, Studies in Polish Jewry, Jews in the Kingdom of Poland, 1815 to 1914. Professor Dynner is a recipient of numerous fellowships, including a Senior National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the Center for Jewish History in 2013, as Chris just mentioned. His research in the JDC New York archives is focused on Jewish traditionalism in Europe during the interwar and Holocaust periods. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Dynner up to speak.
Hello, everybody. I guess we get to take our minds off the elections a little bit today. I hope you voted, but we're going to be talking about perhaps more important things today. Jewish life in Poland between the two world wars and during the Holocaust. I'm only half joking. I think this is one of the most contentious topics of Jewish history, or historiography, as scholars call it. The debates that historians have with one another and the narratives that we come up with. Before I begin, I'd just like to thank, again, the Lewises for their generous fellowship that's allowed me to do this research, for Linda for running such a great show at the JDC archives. Very, very grateful to all those also who've given generously and allowed us to progress in our research like this. Center for Jewish History as well. Such an extraordinary place, real, ingathering of all these different resources and scholars. So very grateful to have been part of the Center for Jewish History, and I hope all their work can continue as well. Now, why contentious? Why is this such a contentious issue? Well, I think a couple of reasons. First of all, when you have a tragedy like the Holocaust, you never quite know what could have been and what the civilization would have been had it still existed. But even before the Holocaust, this is the reserve from which American Jewish immigration is drawn. Around 80% of American Jews come from Eastern Europe, many of them from Poland, which of course has shifting borders, but it's more of a conception. And the issues that arise touch very closely to Jewish identity. This was the place that Hasidism was born. This was the place that anti-Hasidism was born as well. The Musar movement, this movement of piety and self-actualization or self-perfection. This was where a lot of Zionism or Zionist leaders drew their support. And proto-Zionist movements came from here. Ahad Ha'am, and Berdichevsky and Lilienblum and many, many others. This is where Jewish socialism arose as well, the Bund, the workers' movement. But I think that what's happened perhaps in popular culture, thanks to Fiddler on the Roof, Marc Chagall, and other modes of really powerful, potent, kind of imaginative representations of this culture, we really do have a sense of a place of collective piety where people learn their Judaism at home from their parents. They didn't even have to consult books according to certain arguments. They just kind of imbibed it from the culture around them. What I have up here is photography from Roman Vishniak. You might even recognize it. And Vishniak, he goes around, he's working for different organizations, including the Joint, and he's trying to capture that aspect of the culture. So it's easy to get a sense when we look back on Eastern Europe that this was a static situation of collective piety. Historians have tried to correct that, really for the entire last generation. It's been a very different, almost a secularization narrative, where historians will stress socialism occurring here, the Bund, even more so Zionism. And finally, Polonization and acculturation. On the left, second from the left is Tuwim, the great Polish Jewish poet, and all the way to the right is Antoni Słomiński. These are Jews who acculturated very well into Polish society and became really the champions of kind of a Polish Jewish culture. These are the people historians have preferred to write about in recent years. My fear is that there's been an overcorrection. So when I approached this project, and as well as my book on Hasidism, and perhaps even the vodka book, writing about tavern keepers who themselves are usually pretty, at least outwardly pious, I've been trying a little bit to bring us back, not all the way to the myth of collective piety, but to make sure we're not marginalizing the traditionalists, as we'll call them. Today we call them Orthodox Jews. Jews who were really more attuned to the rhythms of traditional Jewish life, really governed by halakha, Jewish law. They had been, I felt, being written out of the history. And so my talk today is a little bit of towards that effort of bringing them back into the story and even emphasizing their role, because the sense I get is throughout the interwar period, yes, secularization was occurring. Yes, the youth were joining Zionist movements and socialist movements, or they were acculturating. However, there was really a strong traditionalist revival as well. It wasn't going away. In fact, as I'm going to argue today, it was even getting stronger. If you look at Jewish politics in Poland, it's very mixed. At the national level, when Poland was reborn, you could actually have Jewish representatives of parliament, the so-called Sejm, and you even had Orthodox Jewish representatives of the Agudat Yisrael, along with Zionist representatives. The socialists never quite made it to the national level in terms of their politics, but it was mixed. It was a situation of contention, of almost cultural warfare. And so this image that I have here from a Rosh Hashanah postcard is almost a wish that these warring cultural groups could, for this day, the new year, kind of get together, put aside their differences, shake hands, realize we're all Jews, we have many of the same issues and problems, economic catastrophes after World War I, rising anti-Semitism, and so on. Let's come together. But if you look closely at the expression on their faces, it's one of deep ambivalence. The cultural war was pretty fierce, if you read some of the rhetoric. It really reached the political level. It was in the press. The Orthodox, as they come to call themselves, are not a dying breed, and I think that's a very important thing to realize. They begin to organize. And what I'll say is the best way to read Polish Jewish culture in this period is not just one of conflict, but also as a kind of cultural encounter. The Orthodox are learning from their secular foes. They rail against them. They rail against their schools, which are seducing our children to read secular books. It's a very gendered language, too, where secular forms of Judaism, Zionism, and so on are represented as a sort of a loose woman who's going to seduce your children away from the virtuous Jewish tradition. It's a fascinating thing to do, to read through the letters of the Chafetz Chaim, some of these other great traditionalist leaders. And they really did feel a lot was at stake, but they're learning from the secular opponents. They're organizing their own political parties. Their own newspapers are being sponsored and founded, printing initiatives. And they're also, I would say most of all, they're focusing on retooling, refurbishing, and reinventing education. And that even includes modest secular education they're including in their school systems. So some of the great yeshivas, like Masivta in Warsaw, actually has 2 hours of secular instruction every day. And the Agudat Yisrael schools, called underneath the umbrella of the Chorev organization, also have hours of secular education, around 2 hours each day. So there is a kind of secularization going on, even among many of the Orthodox, although it's very controlled. I would call it a defensive acculturation. That's a term I've started to come up with. Now, what is keeping these Orthodox or traditionalist organizations afloat? It's not just pure energy, enthusiasm, and spiritual passion that's keeping them afloat. There are two major external phenomena that I'd like to emphasize today. The first is the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union. Soviet Jewish immigration into Poland. Poland is independent. Poland, you may not believe it, but it's tremendous religious freedoms for Jews. In the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution, there are anti-religious campaigns. There are massive pressures to relinquish the traditional Jewish way of life. Institutions are being undermined or outlawed. Clergy, and not just Jewish clergy, but Christian clergy as well, are being arrested, sent to the Gulag, even executed. It seems in many cases the Russian Orthodox clergy have it worse, because those are the cases of torture, exile, and execution. Bishops are being killed. It's a major anti-religious culture that is suppressing Jewish life along with all religious life. But there's also American Jewish philanthropy. So while Soviet Jews are fleeing anti-religious campaigns, many times coming over the border into Poland, and I'm going to show you, sometimes entire yeshivas are coming over the border, there's money flowing in from the United States, including from the American Joint Distribution Committee, but also from many private sources or semi-private sources. Money flowing in to these institutions, and often it's Orthodox Jews who are giving the money. I'll talk about that more as we go on. Now, this is independent Poland, 1918. It's a tremendous moment for Poles who had seen their country or had heard of their country from their parents and grandparents being partitioned, really colonized by Russia, Prussia, and Austria for over a century. Now suddenly they have this independent country called Poland. These are the borders. Note that it includes Vilna, so it's not part of Lithuania, and it includes a lot of territory that Ukrainians held to be their own. It's a very tense situation where Ukrainians find themselves living in Poland in huge numbers. They have a majority, and throughout Poland, they're about 14% of the Polish population. Jews around 10%. It drops to 9% because of immigration. Lithuanians, Belarusians. They all find themselves inside Poland, and they feel colonized themselves. They're yearning for independence themselves. It forces the Poles, I think, in a very right-wing direction, because only 60-65% of the country is ethnically Polish. And yet, to their credit, especially with the rise of Pilsudski in 1928, there's a coup. He's a dictator, but a benevolent one who seems like he's okay with Jews, not very anti-Semitic. To his credit, he keeps the ethnic hatreds to a minimum. So there are times when Jewish life is allowed to flourish in Poland. Not the case in the Soviet Union. Okay, here are a couple of Soviet propaganda posters. This one, you see all religions being crushed, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And here you see a depiction of a capitalist who's riding on the back of the virtuous worker and pointing towards the Bible as justification. The message is religion is oppressing the worker. It's really a tool of oppression, and you get rid of religion as part of this communist revolution, as part of this utopia. Shimon Diemenstein is the head of the Evsektia, this Jewish communist organization. He's originally a Lubavitcher Hasid, and he's a convert to Bolshevism, and he's able to infiltrate very effectively all the underground Jewish organizations like Lubavitch, like Chabad, that are trying to keep Jewish life alive. And he turns out to be very effective. So before the Bolshevik Revolution, this is a map of the yeshivas throughout Eastern Europe. The red ones are Hasidic yeshivas. The blue ones are anti-Hasidic or Misnagdic. The green ones are Musar, which is a movement that began in the late 19th century, emphasizing character development and piety and self-perfection. Okay. What's going to happen with these anti-religious campaigns? And even before that, even with the Bolshevik Revolution itself, they're going to start moving over the border into Poland. And you might see some of the more famous one. Mir is right there in the middle. Underneath it is Kletsk. They're all moving into Poland. Others will simply find themselves within the Polish borders. The Radun yeshiva of the Chafetz Chaim, for example. Some of these Musar yeshivas will move across. But the point is Poland is actually transformed into this yeshiva capital. As Mark Vishnitzer, this Jewish historian, once said, it becomes really the yeshiva capital of the world as a result of the Soviet campaigns. With Stalin's rise, and he really consolidated his power around 1926, we're seeing numbers around 550, 580 yeshiva students, so that's young men, sneaking over the border from the Soviet Union, coming into Poland and studying in the yeshivas. So the Mir yeshiva becomes 60% students from abroad. So not only do you have the yeshivas moving across the border, you have students moving across the border, their families, religious women and girls are moving across as well. They're being sent across into Poland by their parents, and rabbis are coming across the border too. A lot of them are supported by Ezra's Torah, an American Jewish organization. But a lot of them are going to be supported by the Joint as well, but it's going to be more institutional. Okay. So if you look at yeshiva enrollment, the green is 1924, the blue is 1929 to 30, the gold is 1938 to 1939. We don't see anything that you could describe as a religious decline. And that's what I really want to get across here. These are the flagship yeshiva institutions. There are many more that tell the same story. These are just the ones I picked because they're more well known. The Chabad Lubavitch Yeshiva Tomchei Tmimim is going to come into Poland. It's going to show a similar growth of their enrollments doubling, tripling. They can't even keep pace with it. They have to turn students away. The reason I emphasize this is I was trained as a graduate student on this idea of rapid secularization, religious decline, if not outright collapse. And I'm simply not seeing it in these sources. But I am seeing it in the universities. Jewish university enrollment is declining dramatically. Not because of any desire, not because Jewish students are no longer interested in studying universities. That's not it at all. It's a kind of an artificial depression of enrollment where Jewish students are not given financial aid at first. Yeshiva is a free ride. You go there tuition free, you get fed, you get housed, everything, all expense paid vacation to the Talmud. The universities are very different. It's a hostile environment. As we get through the 1930s, you're getting beaten up daily by really fellow students, these gangs of Polish nationalists. And not only is it hard to get in as a Jew, it's hard to stay as a Jew. And by 1937, you have the first so-called ghetto benches, where Jews are being forced to sit at a different part of the room. Even Jewish professors are being harassed and beaten. And finally, there are practically no Jewish students at all, on the eve of the Holocaust. But the numbers in real terms are dropping from around 8,500 to 4,400 by 1938-39. And of course, the numbers of non-Jews are rising. Now, why is this happening? Okay, so they don't like Jews. That's a little bit of a crude way of putting it, though. I think a lot of this is about pride. That Polish society, it's a new country. Jews occupy not just economic niches, but in many places they're still the surrogate middle class. 90% of market stalls are run by Jews in a given town. It's a situation where this seemingly foreign people seems to be predominating in the economy. And what I read when I read Polish anti-Semitic tracts is there's a real sense of embarrassment about this. We should be running our own economy. Now, of course, the solution is accept Jews as Poles. But that may be a little forward-thinking for the time, and Polish nationalism was still not fully formed. There were Poles, especially in the PPS, the Polish Socialist Organization, who believed exactly that. Although the price was, of course, assimilation. They wanted Jews to really speak Polish. They wanted Jews to dress and act Polish and so on. And many Jews actually went along with this. But right-wing nationalism really is on the rise, and you see it in the educational system. So yeshivas emerge as these kind of oases, in a way. If you saw the daily reports of the universities, you wouldn't understand how anybody could study there. Daily reports of Jews being beaten up, and occasionally death as a result. It was just a very, very hostile environment. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, you also have American philanthropy that's affecting this entire structure, okay? And this is where we get into the joint. This is what I've been looking at the past few months. The American Joint Distribution Committee, it's going to originate in World War I. But first, we have the creation on October 4th, 1914, of the Central Committee for the Relief of Jews Suffering Through the War, rather long name we can shorten as Central Relief Committee. This is a predominantly Orthodox organization, Orthodox Jewish organization. It originates as a way of saving Torah study in war-torn Europe. They're extremely well organized. They have a self-taxation system where you purchase stamps, you sign up a pledge to give a certain amount. You have the so-called pushka, where you place your money, and vast fundraising campaigns, including a tour by none other than Cantor Yosela Rosenblatt throughout the United States, concerts that raise large sums of money for Orthodox causes. And the number one Orthodox cause, arguably the only Orthodox cause, Torah education. Okay, so it's a very well-focused and well-organized initiative, and it's first. It arrives on the scene first. October 25th, the American Jewish Relief Committee, the AJRC, is formed to also fund many of these cultural initiatives, secular as well as religious. The Orthodox refused to join it. So on November 27th, the American Joint Distribution Committee is formed. Joint meaning joining these disparate organizations, trying to bring them together in a unified effort to aid the Jews of Eastern Europe during World War I. It's composed of the Central Relief Committee, which is Orthodox, the AJRC, and the People's Relief Committee, which is expressly socialist. The sense I'm getting, and I still need to really verify it with better numbers, but the sense I'm getting is it's a lopsided kind of arrangement when it comes to culture and education. That Central Relief Committee, because it's so focused on a single cause, Torah education, and because the fundraising initiatives are so effective, they seem to have a lot better resources. Now, the AJRC is also very well funded by very prominent philanthropists too, but they're interested in all kinds of efforts, especially economic efforts. If you ever heard of these loan casas, these informal banks where small-scale merchants could borrow money, this is one of the joint initiatives. The People's Relief Committee, too, very focused on economic causes. Now, if you listen to the language of the Central Relief Committee, you hear the difference. What they will claim in one of their letters, which really had a fundraising aspect to it, the Jewish parents who had always sacrificed their last penny in order to give their children a Torah education did not change their traditional habits even during the most stressful years of the war. Local committees were formed in all the Jewish communities, and many a hungered and naked Jewish parent cheerfully handed back part of his meager relief dole to this committee, the Central Relief Committee we're talking about, as a contribution towards his child's education. Jewish mothers clamored, "Give us schools for our growing boys, and never mind the bread or the clothes." Jewish parents starved themselves in order to give their children the rudiments of an education in things Jewish. And by Jewish, they mean Torah. Okay, and it goes on to say that they raised around $3 million by the end of World War I, and they represent the traditional element in Jewry, interested in preserving intact the spiritual heritage of their people, its learning and its culture. They felt all the while that it was hardly worth the effort to save the body of the Jews if the Jewish soul is left to perish. Okay, that's the attitude. I don't see that attitude in these other organizations, not where, education is the be-all and end-all. Zionists, don't forget, are very interested in actual emigration through the Jewish Agency and other organizations. Socialists are very focused on helping the workers economically. The Orthodox seem very focused on education, on learning. And this is what Dr. Cyrus Adler, who's the chairman of the Cultural Committee, is going to inherit. It's this situation. I've come to admire him, really respect his predicament, because he's dealing with a very lopsided situation. A lot of the money for cultural purposes and educational purposes seems to be coming from the Orthodox, and yet he has to try to be fair. Even the socialists have their own organization, the Zionists do not. So what happens is a kind of breakdown in giving, which really favors the Orthodox. 55% is actually a low estimate. I've seen estimates in the Yeshiva University archives as high as 70%. So of all money being given to cultural and educational causes, a majority is being given to the Orthodox. The rust-colored is to the Yiddish or socialist organizations, and the gray is Zionists and everybody else. Now, actually, before I get to that, I want to present an argument here. And this is still a work in progress, but this is the argument I'm coming up with at this point. The educational system, the pressure on Adler is going to be in the favor of the Orthodox for several reasons. Number one, what I mentioned already, their focused giving. This seems to be mostly what the Orthodox care about in the United States. But number two, it's not just the Orthodox, because the Central Relief Committee is able to make the argument, even to non-Orthodox Jews, that these yeshivas, these cheters, are our heritage. This is the Polish Jewish heritage. This is what we are contributing to civilization. This is a cultural reservoir for world Jewry. This is where many of the rabbis are coming from, even in the United States. Sometimes they're recruiting rabbis straight out of these Polish yeshivas. This is our unique contribution. And of course, they're saying you can't say that about anybody else. You can't say that about the Zionists, about the socialists. They arrive earlier on the scene. And as part of this argument, I'm also seeing that the apolitical intent of institutions like the Joint is actually benefiting the Orthodox, because they were there already. So, Adler and Joint advocates are very careful not to engage in social engineering. They don't feel that it's the place of American Jews to be dictating what Polish Jewish society should look like. They want to help rebuild after the destruction of World War I, but they don't want to reinvent Polish Jewry. So they don't want to get involved in any pet projects. This is a real problem for the Zionists because they're relative newcomers on the scene. They're trying to build schools from scratch, from the first time. All the Orthodox are trying to do is refurbish the yeshivas, refurbish the cheder, often just simply change their name into a Chorev-affiliated institution. It's already there because they're older. The socialists, too, with their Yiddishist institutions, are really trying to build for the future and reinvent, and the American Jewish organizations are trying to remain neutral in that kind of a situation, which it seems favors the older institutions. It favors the status quo ante, I'll say. The Orthodox, I also have to say, are quite assertive. The lobbying, if you read through these files, the letters coming from Orthodox advocates far outnumber the letters from anybody else. Requests for meetings, private meetings with prominent rabbis. Some of them arriving, just off the boat from Eastern Europe. Some of them great rabbis. They're making the rounds in the synagogues. And if you went to synagogue on a Saturday before Kiddush, you'd be treated to 15, 20 minutes of this great rabbi from the Mir Yeshiva, from the Kletsk Yeshiva, whatever, who's going to talk to you. He'll give you some Torah, and then he'll talk to you about how our yeshiva is dying, and we desperately need your help. And people will pledge money right away. It's a vast fundraising organization that is extremely focused and extremely assertive. All these aspects are favoring the Orthodox, despite every attempt by Adler and other members of the Joint to remain neutral. The Zionists are the losers in this game because at least the socialists have their own People's Relief Committee. The Zionists don't have any actual organization within the Joint. And so they begin to complain. In fact, they don't just complain, they rail against the joint. If you read Heint or the other Zionist press, you would see the accusations are flying. The joint is anti-Zionist. Now, Adler has a response to these complaints that's very interesting. He writes, there is no point in comparison by numbers of pupils. What he's trying to say is there's so many more students in the Orthodox schools. But I think that there are at least 10 times as many children in the Orthodox schools in Poland as there are in the Tarbut Zionist schools. My own personal sympathies would be with the Orthodox schools, which is very interesting because he's actually chancellor of JTS. And I looked into Mikveh Israel, where he was Parnas, he was president for many years in Philadelphia. It seems like it's a conservative synagogue, but it originates as a Portuguese Sephardic institution, and it's very hard to tell exactly what it is. But he says his sympathies are with these Orthodox schools on the one hand, and I prefer Hebrew to the Yiddish as a language of instruction, also interesting, but not in the slightest have I allowed my sympathies to color my judgment in the matter of the distribution. Tarbut, which is the Zionist organization, is an aggressive movement. In the autumn of 1926, it opened up about 18 to 20 new schools, which is what you have to do if you're a new organization. But he's trying to present the joint as a effort to help refurbish, not recreate, or not create from new. That's the problem. So here's how it breaks down. By 1923 alone, you'll see that the number of schools across the board are actually increasing. The Orthodox increased the most. That mainly has to do with the formal recognition of previously underground or unofficial cheders and other Orthodox institutions. Okay, all you have to do is simply recognize them, and that's going to up the numbers. And by recognizing them, you also have to implement 2 hours of secular instruction per day, mainly in Polish language and literature. And it does change them a little bit. In return, they actually get subsidies, not only from the joint, but from the state itself. So you'll see this whole thing is changing the Orthodox as well. There is a secularization or an acculturation process that's going on as sort of the price of these subsidies. But many, if not most, Orthodox are willing to pay that price. The Zionist organizations do actually grow very fast in the post-war period, as do the Yiddish schools, but nobody's comparing to the Orthodox. By 1935, 70,890 students in the Chorev, or Orthodox schools, just to give you a sense. And it gets even higher. And we're not even counting Beis Yaakov schools yet. Those. Okay. Now, it's not fair, however, to accuse the joint of discriminating or neglecting the Zionist organizations. I drew these figures from various places, and this is what I came up with per year. 1924, 60,000 is the most, but by 1936, 25,000. That seems to be around the average being given to Zionist schools by the joint. But in comparison, if you look over on the right-hand side, 1921 to 35, total aid to so-called Torah institutions is much larger, 2,325,770. It simply has to do with numbers of students. Now, that's the policy. You give more to the school that has more students. That's going to benefit the Orthodox inadvertently. It's going to benefit them. Now, there was a little social engineering going on, and that's in the realm of girls' education. And Adler writes to Felix Warburg, one of the great benefactors in 1928, the education of girls among Jews in Eastern Europe, as you know, has been horribly neglected, and I think a good part of the breakdown of the morals of women has been due to that. The breakdown of morals of women is code word for prostitution. The war years saw a real rise in Jewish prostitution. This apparently continues throughout the interwar period. What is the cure? What is the solution for any problem? In the Orthodox mindset is education. Okay? Education is a cure-all. And Adler seems privy to that viewpoint. If you start building schools for girls, and this becomes the Beis Yaakov school system, which Naomi Seidman is writing on as well, this develops in a tremendous organization. These are the numbers I have, between 200 and 248 schools. The numbers are changing all the time. Naomi actually mentioned to me that she feels that some were schools that were being built that they were counting. So it's very hard to know exactly where we stood. But whatever it is, it's a very impressive achievement. 35,000 girls by 1935 is going to continue to grow. And there's money. 1 year alone, I believe 1934 to 1935, I see $40,000 being devoted to these Beis Yaakov schools. And they're Orthodox. Okay. The rationale for that is we're not going to try to change anybody. This seems to be what the masses of Polish Jews want for their education. And so who are we to interfere? But of course, by funding, by aiding the school system, you are kind of you're making your influence be felt in one way or another. Maybe inadvertently, but it's happening. The Central Relief Committee has a very powerful, potent argument for the support of its yeshivas, which are seen as the supreme Jewish educational organizations. They argue in several letters I've seen, the yeshiva still reigns supreme in Jewish life in Eastern and Central European countries and in Palestine. Over there, many thousands of students devote for a number of years all their time for diligent study in the yeshivot. They are our future spiritual leaders and teachers, and they are the carriers of our culture to generations to come. So not only are they becoming repositories of Torah, but they're serving the rest of world Jewry in their various institutions. Central Relief Committee members represent the traditional element in Jewry, interested in preserving intact the spiritual heritage of their people, learning and its culture. They felt all the while that it was hardly worth the effort to save the body of the Jew if his soul is left to perish in an abyss of ignorance, and without proper education, the Jewish youth would surely be lost to their people. And they'll use imagery like the yeshivas are the cultural reservoir of world Jewry, that they are the heritage, they are the fountain of Judaism, which is the title of my talk. I don't want you to take it literally. This is obviously for polemical and fundraising purposes, but I want you to take seriously the effects that the myth is having. It's a very potent kind of argument to be making. I've heard this is the Jewish science. This is the Jewish science. They have their astronomy and philosophy and physics. We have Torah. Okay? And this is the pinnacle of the Jewish contribution to civilization. It's a very resonant argument. It's going to affect religious and non-religious Jews alike in America. But the numbers for monthly subsidies, yearly subsidies actually, the regular subsidies to yeshivas are not that high from the joint. If you look at, now there's funny, a lot of yeshivas, 142 total in 1935, you'll see they're all running a huge deficit. And the joint is only giving a couple of $1,000s per year, but those are only the regular subsidies. What I see going through the documents are $5,000 here, $5,000 there, one-time subsidies as well. And it seems to always be in response to about 10 to 15 letters from various rabbis and other Orthodox religious leaders who who are desperate, in their pleas to save this dying yeshiva or that dying yeshiva. Some of them the flagship institutions of Eastern Europe, like Mir. And Adler feels a lot of pressure to do this. But don't forget, he's getting a lot of pressure from the other side as well. And you start seeing letters like, why are we funding all these yeshivas? Aren't there other worthy institutions, secular institutions perhaps? But it's probably a ratio of 1 to 10 that you get that kind of an argument, because the lobbying efforts of the Orthodox are just so overwhelming. And they believe it. I don't think they're being, opportunistic or anything like that. They really, really, truly believe that this is the heritage of Polish Jewry, and we need to save it. And Adler, who's an Assyriologist and a Bible scholar, a very modern, person in a lot of ways, he seems like he's affected. He's really influenced by that heritage argument. It's not just nostalgia we're talking about either. It's, what's the genius of the people? What do they have to contribute to the world? In 1930, the flagship yeshiva, Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, is founded. What I want to emphasize here, as in the case of the other yeshivas too, is the joint is a very small part of the overall budget. In fact, when you look at the breakdown of the yeshiva budgets, at least half is coming from simple fundraising on an informal level in synagogues throughout the United States, or very generous benefactors. Okay, so the joint is only part of this effort. Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, by the way, it's an attempt to create the ultimate yeshiva where it's very difficult to gain admission. You're fully funded. You don't have to worry about finding eating days among the locals. You have a cafeteria, you have a dormitory. It has a curriculum that seems very modern by those contemporary standards. It's an attempt really to vie with Harvard or Oxford. And they do receive generous funding at first, although they really struggle towards the end of the 30s. The rise of Hitler is going to push more Jews into these yeshivas from Germany and then from Austria. Parents are sending their sons over into Poland to study in the yeshiva because it's no longer tenable to study in the universities or in other schools. There are Orthodox in Germany and Austria as well who still want their sons to get the best education possible, but they're also fleeing an increasingly desperate, repressive situation. Hitler comes to power. He's underestimated to a great extent. There are those who don't want to believe that he has terrible intentions for the Jews, even within the joint. I'm going to give you an example of, now this is not the joint itself, but it's a report that they received about Adolf Hitler from Dewey. I didn't get his first name. I'm looking into who he is exactly. But he reports to the joint, Dewey went to Berlin from Poland to hear Hitler's speech. He saw Hitler at close range for 2.5 hours. He knew him 2 years ago and could see no change, no sign of a nervous breakdown. So you see, there was really a hope that this guy was crazy, that he couldn't keep it together, he didn't have the nerves to handle that he was, didn't have the mental capacity, he couldn't act presidential in modern terms, and but he's reassuring them, no, he held it all together in this rally throughout this speech. He makes quite a healthy impression and is a man who can control his nerves. His speech was conciliatory, so there's the hope or the wishful thinking. Like many others, he blamed everything on the Versailles Treaty, on the ignorance and intransigence of the people who made the treaty. It was their fault. It's their fault that the Nazi Party has had to behave as it does. If appeasement, and he uses the word appeasement, could be achieved, in Dewey's opinion, Germany certainly could be induced to a better treatment of her minorities. Those hopes are obviously going to be dashed very soon. because in a few months, Hitler's going to be invading Poland. But at the time, I just want to show that on the eve of World War II, there really were hopes that Hitler was not the monster that the press was making him out to be. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. This obviously affects the yeshivas, but not as much as you would think, because most of the major yeshivas were actually in territories that will become Soviet territories. Important to emphasize, because we just kind of get this picture of, 1939, it's all over. Actually, half of Polish Jewry was living under Soviet control. It was no picnic. You were usually being deported to Siberia unless you signed an oath of citizenship. But still, it wasn't what was going on in Nazi-occupied Poland. Here's a map. Now, to give you a sense of what's going on, the green is all Soviet or future Soviet. That general government, it looks a little green, but it's actually Germany. It's part of Germany. Okay, and that's where the map is, according to Molotov Ribbentrop Pact. And if you look up at the top, you'll see Vilna, or Vilnius, as it is in Lithuania. That is the capital of Lithuania, which for the time being is independent. This is very significant. It's not part of the Soviet Union. Stalin says, yeah, you can have Vilnius as your capital. You can have your independent country. He reneges, as of course he always does, but for almost a year, Lithuania, and especially Vilnius, is a magnet for these yeshivas. So many of the great yeshivas, both in German and Soviet-occupied territories, are moving into Vilna. I call it Vilna for shorthand. Including Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin. Vilna, December 4th, 40 students and 4 teachers of Poland's greatest Jewish religious college, Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin, have escaped to Vilna. All of those arrested were maltreated, and it was rumored that the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Frommer, was tortured to death, okay, probably by the Germans. But 40 of them arrive in Vilnius. It's going to become an effort, especially among the Orthodox, to save as many of these yeshiva students as possible and the rabbis. Why? It's very simple. They're not just people. Now you're getting down to saving lives, but they're more than people. They're repositories of Torah. And as repositories of Torah, they get priority. It's very problematic. Women can't be repositories of Torah, according to the traditional system. So you're really saving young men. If they happen to be married, which isn't the case with most of the yeshiva students, but it's the case of the rabbis and the kollel students, if they happen to be married, they're often being rescued along with their wives and with their children, including their daughters. But it is a gendered situation that we have to kind of confront as a reality. Chaim Moser Grodzinski, the great leader of Vilna, and really, you could argue, all of Polish Jewry in some cases, reports on December 31st, 1939, in Vilnius are now all the yeshivas of former Poland. The number of, all of them, he says, the number of the students is about 2,000. Beside them are some married students that are preparing to become rabbis. Altogether, the number of the yeshiva students reaches 2,100. Among them are many very able and very learned men. Beside this are here at Vilnius now a considerable number of rabbis that could not remain in their old places and were compelled to quit their towns. You, dear Professor Adler, are known as a religious man that is very favorably disposed towards our institutions and has understanding of the fact that besides material needs, there are also spiritual needs that must be cared for, because this gives the nation strength to preserve or persevere through hard times. He's asking, of course, for aid, for financial support for these now transplanted yeshivas into Vilnius. July 30th, 1940, this is right before the Soviet Union is going to take Vilnius. Out of the 5,000 yeshiva bachurim, of those yeshivot which had been evacuated to Lithuania, only 2,000 came along, and 300 of the teaching staff. Rabbi Kalmanovich, who of the Mir Yeshiva, wanted to point out that this was already the elite of Jewish learning that must be saved, and that their number could not be reduced any further. In addition to these yeshivot from Poland, it is necessary to save the Lithuanian yeshivot, in which there are about 500. So what we need is enough money, and eventually he's going to be asking for visas for 28,000 yeshiva students. That number can actually go up. Yeah, I said, 2,800. Okay. Now, this is the Sugihara story. I don't claim to be an expert on this yet, although I've seen a lot of documents now which are giving me insight to what's going on. The first thing, these were the visas that were being, these are the visas that are being offered to yeshiva students to get them out. Okay, what happens is this: the Soviets are going to annex Vilnius and the rest of Lithuania. These yeshiva students are fleeing the Soviets, not the Nazis. Okay, very important. Because the desperation, they're talking about, we need visas, we need money, and you have organizations at home, specific yeshiva offices, synagogues at home, that are sponsoring, pledging $8 a day for the upkeep of these yeshiva students once they move to Japan or Japanese-dominated areas like Shanghai. Right? They're painting it in terms of saving their lives, which, of course, the way it gets merged in the popular imagination is they're fleeing the Nazis. But nobody knows yet that Germany is going to invade the Soviet Union. So what are they so afraid of? Why are they speaking in terms of life and death when it's only the Soviet Union, and the worst that can happen to you, seemingly, is Siberia? So that's what I've been puzzling with this past week. And I start to see what they're really afraid of. Okay, number one, the anti-religious campaigns, obviously. That if you're listed as a cleric, which these yeshiva students would be, it means deportation to Siberia, pretty much by this time. No transforming you into a worker and re-education, it's just straight to Siberia. Number two, and I think this might be even more importantly, I saw this in one document. Many of our yeshiva students are former Soviet residents, if not citizens, who fled into the yeshivas. Remember I said it was over 500 of them per year in some years? That's a lot. So a lot of these yeshivas are really composed of Jews who used to live in Soviet territories. They've experienced these anti-religious campaigns, and they're afraid of being found out as somebody who fled illegally into Poland, and now they're back under Soviet control. They really are fearing for their lives. They're fearing that they'll be considered traitors. So that seems to be the level of desperation that's going on. Sugihara can only provide transit visas. Shanghai is not a final destination. It's only a temporary destination. They try to put Curacao as the final destination because there's no visa requirement for entry, but that doesn't work after a while. So it's a really serious situation. He defies the orders of his superiors and keeps issuing these visas. He seems to truly believe that this is a life and death issue for these yeshiva students and for many others as well. And lo and behold, the entire Mir Yeshiva, for example, is transported to Shanghai. I looked in the timeline for Mir Yeshiva because that's the most famous case and the most members of a single group. September 1st, 1939, 350 students, faculty, and families flee to Vilna. August 3rd, 1940, the Soviet Union annexes Vilna, and they start receiving visas now. from the Dutch and Japanese embassies. January 1st, 1941, the yeshiva sails to Japan. They receive $37,000 from the joint to do so. March 1941, 300 of the students reach Kobe, Japan, and reestablish the yeshiva. June 24th, Nazis enter Vilna. September 1941, 250 go to Shanghai. 50 go to Palestine. And the Mir Yeshiva is saved for the most part. And you have lists of names, and some of my friends descend, even they have parents who were part of this Mir Yeshiva rescue. It's a happy story, but it's also a troubling and sad story, because the joint is getting a lot of criticism for this as well. Why are you rescuing yeshiva bachers? Are there not equally important physicists, doctors, lawyers, teachers, other professions happen to be secular? Why aren't they worthy of your attention? Well, what seems to be going on is, once again, the Orthodox are there first, they're better organized, and they're better funded. So, for example, Mir, they have their own office in New York. Kalmanovich is already in the United States. He visits or attempts to visit the joint several times. They gain audience with senators, asking for money and for visas to help rescue these yeshiva students. Not far behind them is Rabbi Gerari and the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself of Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism. They come up with a list of 300 Tomchei Tmimim students. It gets whittled down to 50, and they get visas for a lot of them as well. And they're willing to put up the money. They don't always like paying it back after the war, but they too come up with the money or the pledge to be self-supporting. That's what the joint is faced with. So they may actually agree with the argument. In fact, certain members of the joint are outraged that this is going on. Isaac Mayer Wise, who's in an advisory capacity at the joint, is furious over this. You know, he's arguing, how are we going to integrate these people into American society? You know, a bunch of yeshivas. Like, you know, and can't we just focus on a symbolic nucleus of this great, reservoir of Jewish learning? Do we need to really rescue entire yeshivas? You know, they're very ambivalent, only because you can't put a price on somebody's life because of their cultural affiliation. In the eyes of the Orthodox, you can, because these aren't just people; these are repositories of Torah. And that's the kind of dilemma that's being faced throughout this horrible, horrible time. In the end, Rabbi Kalmanovich of the Mir Yeshiva writes, and this is in the middle of the Holocaust actually, I feel it as my first duty, coming from that cauldron of misery and suffering, to extend my deep felt thanks to the leaders and workers of the JDC, the joint, for the colossal work they have done for the thousands of refugees in Lithuania. The JDC was first on the spot, and their relief was immediate, kindly, and thorough. I do not hesitate to proclaim your deeds to the world, and you may count me as an eyewitness to your life-saving activity on that field. Never in the history of refugee work has such speed and such warmth been manifest. February 12th, 1940. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Dynner, for that wonderful presentation. We have time for questions. You can raise your hand, and someone will come around with the mic. If you have questions, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for that very thorough, impressive overview. Here, sorry. Actually, I'm 1/4 Polish, and I've never been to Poland, and I won't go. But I'm curious, when you spoke about the emergence of the Yiddish institutions and the rise in a very short period of time. Do you think that may have contributed to the virulent anti-Semitism that existed in Poland prior to World War II's breakout?
Okay, so let's be specific about what you're talking about. You're talking about a Yiddishist movement that's raising children, educating children in Yiddish, purposely trying to preserve a language that is other than Polish or the language of the land. I asked my students at Sarah Lawrence this once, towards the end of the semester, reading modern Jewish literature, and they actually looked horrified at me. I asked the same question, and what I was saying, maybe I asked it even more provocatively, and I said, is this maybe a bad idea to be cultivating such difference, such linguistic difference at this time? I'm not trying to blame the victim here, but it doesn't seem like the smartest move when you're trying to be tolerated and accepted in a society to be speaking a different language. And not just speaking it, but actually cultivating it in your children. And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, rather like Sarah Lawrence students tend to do, rather defiantly, why should they? Why should they conform? Okay, what you ask is a philosophical question. I think in an ideal world, yes, we should tolerate people who learn and cultivate a different language. But you have to admit, it's a little nerve-wracking for a new country like Poland to see this going on when Polish is barely the language of the land. Imagine this happening, which it did in the state of Israel, where Yiddish was also being cultivated. And there's tremendous nervousness, even today a little bit. You'll see like remnants of this nervousness that they should really be learning Hebrew. They should be speaking Hebrew. We need a Hebrew-speaking society. So you see how difficult this must have been for Polish Catholics and many Polonized Jews to see this going on. It was problematic. On the other hand, this becomes a really potent form of creativity. Some of the great Yiddish poetry, all of Jewish history is being composed at this time. Young Vilna, this great group of Yiddishists, and other groups as well. Novels, short stories being written in Yiddish. Somehow the other languages don't capture it. Somehow it's not translatable. It gets lost in translation. So I can't answer it. I can't answer it. I understand both sides of it. This Yiddishist movement was a powerful, positive phenomenon, but I understand why so many were opposed to it as well. Do you want to call? You want me to?
Thank you so much, Glenn. I just spent the day in the archive last week, and I was telling somebody, the whole archive is basically a bunch of letters of people asking for money and a bunch of responses of the joint saying, sorry, we have limited resources, but we distribute it fairly. And your talk was just a model of how to, I just like, it was, how do I read this archive? What do I do here? And the question of how those resources were distributed is such a painful and powerful one. And the way they're distributed among secular versus religious, and then the question of gender is so interesting. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And I'll say that one of the things I noticed that I think is relevant to your talk is that the Beis Yaakov schools had two sets of letterhead, kind of for internal consumption and for external consumption. I don't know if you noticed that. And the internal consumption was that it was a girls' educational system, and for external consumption, it was the Beis Yaakov movement for the education and protection of Jewish girls and women. And the word protection is also clearly code, and the fact that this is what the London and New York offices had, and Vienna offices had on their letterhead as opposed to the education, I think is a sign that you're right, that for external consumption, the way Beis Yaakov was marketed was as an anti-prostitution educational system. I don't think it actually functioned like that. I think that's what made American Jews open their pocketbooks. So it occurred to me while listening to you
that the letter from the 93 Beis Yaakov girls, which I also saw in the JDC archives, who supposedly committed suicide rather than be taken as prostitutes for the German army, was actually maybe another fundraising document, as there are so many in the JDC archives, playing that particular card to try to get some money from the JDC in the old way that was the only way that Orthodox Jewish women could hope to get any kind of funding. So that's a comment. And then the question is about Esther Farbstein's discussion of the rescue of rebbes and heads of yeshiva and all that, and her defense of this practice, which obviously this is the most controversial stuff that's going on right now in Holocaust studies, is that these people were particular targets. It's not just that they were the repositories of Torah and learning, but that they were also the first to be captured and tortured, etc., and that she considers it totally appropriate for that reason, and not just for some symbolic Torah reason, for the Jews inside Europe as well as outside Europe to have focused their attention on rescuing these people. So I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, thank you very much for raising that. I have never seen that in any document so far as a justification for saving these yeshiva boys. Okay, it could be accurate, but they're not making that argument as far as I can see. I could change my mind once I see this, but as of today, I've simply seen that the need for them to survive, it means the survival of Judaism. You know, and I feel that they would have been making that argument at the time had it been the most pressing issue. I don't doubt that religious Jews were singled out for harassment and so on. But the thing that always gets mixed up here is we're talking about the Soviets more than we're talking about the Nazis in these periods. You know, we're talking about rescuing yeshivas that are within now the Soviet Union. They're given a month or two to either declare their allegiance to the Soviet system and regime, or be deported to Siberia, or if they can, simply get out. So the argument just doesn't make as much sense if you realize that that's the context that these yeshivas are struggling for survival within, not within Nazi-occupied Poland. So that's where I feel like the two histories are getting merged in everyone's minds, and everything becomes Nazi, 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 when the story I'm seeing is actually fleeing the Soviets. Nobody could have known for sure the Nazis were going to invade a year later. I mean, nobody had a crystal ball, and Stalin looked incredibly strong at that point. So it's difficult for me to get on board with that, but I'm open to it. Sure. See, this is all about the power. You need to find the person with the microphone. There we go.
Who was first? Yes.
Thanks for a terrific talk. In the beginning of your talk, you compared JDC support to Orthodox and non-Orthodox education students. And the conclusion was it was per capita, across the board, even. The second part of your talk, you talk about the support of the JDC for the Orthodox, for evacuating the yeshiva students, and suggest that this is out of proportion. So what is the other side of the equation? What else was the joint doing at this time in Poland or in this region? How do you compare the two? I mean, yes, it's a beautiful story you're telling, And a second question, just sort of a mini question. How does one sail from Poland to Shanghai? Wouldn't it be through the Trans-Siberian Railway? Doesn't one go through Siberia? And wouldn't that be just or more scary than settling in Siberia?
Yeah, I don't think anybody wanted to get near Siberia at this point. Although in retrospect, it wasn't nearly as bad as what was happening, within Nazi-occupied Poland. But okay, I haven't looked into it too deeply. But as of yesterday, it was the Thomas Cook ship company that was being paid by the Joint and other institutions as well that was allowing these students to sail to Shanghai, to first Kobe, Japan, and then Shanghai.
They went through Russia first, Moscow, then through the Transman, through Vladivostok.
Okay, thank you. So we have somebody who knows.
Sorry, my grandfather was
Okay.
They went through the whole
So they did go through. Okay.
They went to Moscow first, stayed there for a few days, then went through the Trans, that line that went through Siberia.
Okay.
Vladivostok, and then there to Japan.
Okay, so thank you very much for that.
People in my family, as soon as the Suez Canal was open in 1869, traveled from Odessa across the Black Sea through Constantinople, down the Suez Canal, and around India to get to Asia.
Really? Wow. So there was another route as well. Okay, fascinating. So I'll have to look into all these routes. I wasn't at that point yet. Now, but you asked another sort of provocative question. So what was the rest of the Joint doing besides rescuing yeshiva boys? I'm getting the sense a lot of it was economic, like simply allowing people to survive. As long as these offices could function, and they are continuing even within Nazi-occupied, until the U.S. declares war on Germany, they're continuing to function. They're providing basic food, clothing, shelter, that kind of a thing, and they consider that to be number one priority. I think we're back to the same formula where the Orthodox seem to be one-issue voters. Education, education, education. Forget about the body, we care about the soul. And that's a tough thing to compete against. When the other groups seem to be having all these other issues that they consider just as important as maybe even more important than education, right?
I would just like to add here that at that period, the Joint was involved in many, many rescue operations in many parts of the world, including assistance to about 15 to 18,000 Jewish refugees in Shanghai, not necessarily the Mir Group, but in addition to the Mir Group, there were thousands of other refugees in Shanghai, but there were efforts to help people in many, many places around the world at that time in their rescue operations.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, very enlightening on many interesting points. I wanted to ask you about a couple of things. One is about Siberia. I very much appreciated what you said about the fact that they were, in the first instance, initially fleeing that Russian possibility, Soviet possibility there. But and you're right, of course, that what happened in Europe was yet worse. But one shouldn't minimize it. That's to say, I personally know people that were transported to Siberia. One of them is still alive. He's very old now. But he described to me how people were these were very religious Jews, and people were transported for that reason, and they were dying left and right around him, he described to me. So it wasn't just a theoretical thing, and of course it pales in comparison with the Nazis, but in itself it was quite a horror.
Yeah, and I completely agree. That's what I was actually trying to convey, but yeah.
And then the second thing is about the state of mind of Jews in Poland in the interwar period. So you pointed out that yeshiva students had risen, the number of students had risen. I'm sure that's correct. But it was suffused late in the interwar period with a tremendous pessimism, both about their long-term prospects there and specifically about the survival of Jewish religious life. People who were there told me when I was young that they could remember, for example, that there were all these yeshiva students, but they had trouble getting married because women were reluctant to tie themselves to a future that seemed so unlikely to survive in Eastern Europe, in Poland as it was then. One last thing I wanted to ask you about, which is a delicate point and slightly more, and I don't know if you have documentation on this, but one person who was there, a relative of mine, told me he had fled from Poland with his parental family to Lithuania, and he was the son of a Hasidic Rebbe, and he told me that when they reached Lithuania, and they contacted these organizations, the ones that helped yeshiva students and so on, he told me that there was a difference about whether you were Misnagdish or Hasidic and how they handled you, and that these organizations, that, according to him...
Who's the they?
That means the Vad Hatzalah, where there was working
Vad
there.
Hatzalah, okay.
That the Vad Hatzalah distinguished,
Wow.
and they wanted to work with Misnagdim, and he found that his family, as Hasidim, did not get as warm a reception from them. Now later, his family survived because they got Sugihara visas, and they escaped actually. So I wanted to ask you about that pessimism about Jewish life in interwar Poland, and what are the further distinctions between Orthodox and non-Orthodox?
Now, on the last point, I haven't seen it yet, although it says something that Chabad Lubavitch really acted so independently that they would often, come up with their own funding and so on. That might speak to what you're talking about, a sort of anti-Hasidic discrimination going on. I'll let you know, I haven't seen the Vad Hatzalah collection yet at YU. I haven't gone through that yet. But I'll look for that now that you mention it. Now, the issue of pessimism is very complicated because I often see it in a fundraising context. Our yeshivas are emptying out, and the numbers don't match it. Okay, they're actually rising. So are they just saying that to try to arouse more support among their potential donors? Well, I think there really is. I think you're right. There really is a fear, an anxiety, a pessimism perhaps, but it's tempered by a very powerful optimism that nobody seems to recall. And that is, we have a solution. Give us money for our yeshivas. All we need is money. The Torah speaks for itself. Education, again, is the cure-all. If you give us the resources we need, we will bring the youth back from these sleazy, frivolous kinds of learning going on in the secular world. We have no problem competing with them, with our virtuous woman, the Torah. That all we need is the resources. And perhaps, reinvent a little bit. The Piaseczner Rebbe starts coming up with more progressive modes of imparting knowledge. You don't hit the child anymore. You make the child your ally. We have to excite the heart, not just the mind. All kinds of things that teachers today or educators today will talk about with a different kind of jargon. He was speaking about, so they are also reforming their methodology, their educational methods, but the bottom line seems to be the same. An abiding optimism about the power of Torah education. The Chavetz Chaim is just as pessimistic as he is optimistic. That, yes, the yeshivas are emptying out, the Beit Midrash is emptying out, the young women don't want to marry yeshiva bachers. On the other hand, there's a core that's there, that's still learning, and we just need to ignite this spark, and it's going to blaze away, and Torah education will overcome everything. Okay, so that's how I try. And this is after very deep analysis of many, many of these polemics about the dying issue. Sorry? Oh, you should contribute now to my issue?
I read a lot of that literature in my home when I was growing up. I want to thank you all for coming. We have a table outside with some literature. You can sign up for our e-newsletter, see some of the information about various programs coming up. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.